Since the dawn of time, Moses' story has captivated hearts and minds. It's filled with miracles, legendary moments, and divine encounters. But beneath the surface lies a deeper narrative, one of a man full of doubt, struggle, and unexpected courage. What if Moses wasn't just the fearless leader we've come to know, but a man like us, wrestling with weakness and uncertainty? And yet, through it all, he became one of history's greatest figures. In this video, we'll explore the untold side of Moses' life, his humanity, his failures, and how God used him in extraordinary ways. If you've ever wondered how an imperfect person can achieve the impossible, this story is for you. Stay with us as we uncover the amazing journey of Moses, as you've never heard it before. Chapter 1. A Desperate Beginning. Our story begins in a dark time for the Hebrew people. Enslaved in Egypt, they lived under the constant threat of oppression and death. Pharaoh, fearful of the growing Hebrew population, had ordered all newborn boys to be thrown into the Nile. Can you imagine the terror of Hebrew mothers, the heart-wrenching pain of knowing your newborn son was condemned to die? In the midst of this darkness, a child is born. His mother, Jochebed, looks at her baby and sees something special in him. With a broken heart, but full of hope, she makes a bold decision. She builds a small ark of reeds, waterproofs it with tar and pitch, and places her precious child in it. With tears in her eyes and a prayer on her lips, she leaves him floating among the reeds of the Nile. Can you imagine this mother's inner conflict? On one hand, the maternal instinct to protect her child at all costs. On the other, faith that God had a greater plan. How many times in our lives do we face similar decisions where we have to trust in the invisible? Chapter 2. From Prince to Fugitive. But the divine plan was already in motion. Pharaoh's daughter, walking by the river, finds the baby. Moved by compassion, she decides to adopt him as her own. And here comes the ironic twist of the story. The baby's own sister, who had been watching the basket, offers to find a Hebrew nurse. Thus, Jochebed ends up raising her own son, but now under the protection of the palace. Moses grows up between two worlds, the luxury and power of Egyptian royalty and the heritage and faith of his Hebrew people. Have you ever felt divided between two identities, two cultures? Moses lived this duality day after day, a tension that would eventually reach a breaking point. One day, as an adult, Moses witnesses an Egyptian overseer brutally beating a Hebrew slave. His blood boils, indignation consumes him. In an act of passion and rage, Moses kills the Egyptian and hides his body in the sand. But his secret doesn't last long. Soon he realizes that his act is known, and fearing for his life, he flees to the desert of Midian. Here, friends, we see a Moses very different from the confident leader we know. He's a man tormented by guilt, running from his past, seeking a new beginning. How many of us have felt that desire to escape, to reinvent ourselves far from our mistakes? Chapter 3. The Burning Bush. In Midian, Moses finds a new life. He marries Zipporah, daughter of a local priest, and becomes a shepherd. For 40 years he lives a quiet life, far from the bustle and intrigues of Egypt. But fate, or rather God, had other plans for him. One day, while shepherding his flock near Mount Horeb, Moses sees something extraordinary, a bush that burns but is not consumed. Intrigued, he approaches, and it's then that he hears God's voice calling him by name. "Moses, Moses," says the voice. "Here I am," he responds, not knowing that these simple words would change the course of his life and history. God reveals to Moses his plan. He wants him to return to Egypt and free his people from slavery. Can you imagine Moses' surprise? After 40 years, when he probably thought his life of adventures was over, God gives him the most important mission of his life. But Moses, far from feeling honored, feels terrified. "Who am I to go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" he asks. His insecurity is palpable. Here we see a man who, despite his royal upbringing and life experience, feels completely inadequate for the task entrusted to him. How many times have we felt like this? Called to do something that seems beyond our capabilities? God's response to Moses is the same he gives us today: "I will be with you." Chapter 4. Confronting Pharaoh. But Moses keeps making excuses. What if they don't believe me? What if they ask who sent me? God, patient but firm, gives him signs and reveals his name. I am who I am. A name that speaks of God's eternity and immutability. Finally, Moses plays his last card. "Lord, I have never been eloquent. I am slow of speech and tongue." Some interpret this as a stuttering problem, others as a simple lack of eloquence. Either way, we see a deeply human Moses, full of doubts and insecurities. God, in his infinite wisdom, provides Aaron, Moses' brother, as a spokesperson. With all his doubts resolved, although probably not all his insecurities, Moses finally accepts his mission and returns to Egypt. What follows is a series of dramatic events that have captured the imagination of generations. Moses and Aaron present themselves before Pharaoh, demanding the release of the Israelites. "Let my people go," becomes Moses' battle cry. But Pharaoh, proud and stubborn, refuses. And so begin the famous 10 plagues. Water turned to blood, frogs, lice, flies, livestock pestilence, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and finally, the death of the firstborn. Each plague is a demonstration of God's power over the Egyptian gods, each more devastating than the last. Have you ever wondered why God chose this method? Why not simply free the Israelites with a snap of his divine fingers? Perhaps because this was not just a battle for the freedom of a people, but a demonstration of who the true God is, both for the Egyptians and for the Israelites. Chapter 5. The Exodus. Finally, after the last and most terrible plague, Pharaoh yields. The Israelites are freed, but the story is far from over. In one of the most dramatic episodes in the Bible, Pharaoh changes his mind and pursues the Israelites to the Red Sea. Imagine the scene. 1 million people trapped between a furious army and a relentless sea. Panic spreads among the crowd. Some cry out to God, others curse Moses for bringing them out of Egypt. "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die?" they shout at him. It's in this critical moment that we see Moses' true greatness. Despite his own fear, how could he not have it in such a situation? He remains firm in his faith. "Do not be afraid," he tells the people. "Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." And then, in one of the most spectacular miracles in the Bible, God opens the sea, creating a dry path for the Israelites to cross. Can you imagine what it must have been like to walk between walls of water, with the sound of the Egyptian army approaching behind? The fear, the adrenaline, the disbelief at what they were witnessing. Once the Israelites cross, the waters close over the Egyptian army, destroying it completely. It's a moment of triumph, of final liberation. Moses and the Israelites sing a song of praise to God, celebrating their freedom and the divine power that made it possible. Chapter 6. The Wilderness Journey. But Moses' story is far from over. What follows is a 40-year journey through the desert, a period of trials, miracles, and nation-building. Moses becomes a leader, judge, and prophet to his people. We see God providing miraculously, manna from heaven, water from a rock. But we also see Moses' frustration with a people who constantly complain and long to return to the security of slavery in Egypt. Isn't this a reflection of our own human nature? How many times do we prefer the known, even if it's painful, to the unknown that God offers us? One of the most significant moments occurs on Mount Sinai. Moses ascends the mountain and receives the Ten Commandments directly from God, the basis of the moral law that would influence not only the Israelites, but much of Western civilization. But while Moses is on the mountain, the impatient people build a golden calf to worship. When Moses comes down and sees this, his anger is tremendous. He breaks the stone tablets with the commandments and orders severe punishment for the idolaters. This episode reveals the complexity of Moses' character. He's not just a meek leader, but a man capable of righteous anger, a man who understands the seriousness of betraying God. It's a stark reminder of the constant struggle between faith and doubt, obedience and rebellion, that characterizes not only the Israelites' journey, but our own spiritual journeys as well. Chapter 7. The Test of Leadership. As the years in the wilderness stretch on, Moses faces countless challenges. He must not only lead a massive group of people through harsh desert conditions, but also establish laws, settle disputes, and keep the people's faith alive. One of the most poignant moments comes when Moses sends 12 spies to scout the Promised Land. 10 return with tales of giants and insurmountable obstacles, spreading fear among the people. Only 2, Joshua and Caleb, encourage the people to trust in God's promise. The people's lack of faith results in God decreeing that this generation will not enter the Promised Land. They must wander in the desert for 40 years until a new generation arises. Can you imagine the weight of this sentence on Moses' shoulders? The disappointment, the frustration, the challenge of leading a people who have just been told their journey is far from over. Yet Moses perseveres. He continues to lead, to teach, to mediate between God and the people. His patience and dedication are truly remarkable. How many of us would have the strength to continue in the face of such setbacks and constant complaints? Chapter 8. The Man Behind the Myth. As we near the end of Moses' story, it's important to remember that despite all his achievements, Moses was human. He had moments of doubt, of anger, of weakness. One such moment occurs when the people are complaining about lack of water. God tells Moses to speak to a rock and water will come out. But Moses, frustrated with the people's constant grumbling, strikes the rock twice with his staff instead. This act of disobedience has severe consequences. God tells Moses that because of this, he will not be allowed to enter the Promised Land. It's a heartbreaking moment. After all these years of faithful service, one moment of weakness costs Moses his ultimate goal. But even in this, we see God's justice tempered with mercy. While Moses cannot enter the Promised Land, God does allow him to see it from the top of Mount Nebo. There, after blessing Joshua as his successor, Moses dies, and God himself buries him. The Bible says of Moses, "No prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face." Deuteronomy 34:10. Despite his flaws and mistakes, Moses' intimate relationship with God set him apart. Chapter 9. The Legacy of Moses. As we conclude our journey through Moses' life, what can we learn from this extraordinary man? First, we see that God often chooses the most unlikely people for his greatest works. Moses, a stuttering shepherd with a checkered past, became one of the greatest leaders in history. This reminds us that our past doesn't define our future, and our weaknesses don't disqualify us from God's call. Second, Moses' story teaches us about perseverance. Despite countless obstacles, setbacks, and disappointments, Moses kept going. He teaches us that faith isn't about never doubting, but about continuing to trust, even in the midst of our doubts. Third, we learn about the importance of intimacy with God. Moses' strength came from his close relationship with God. He talked with God face to face as a man speaks with his friend. Exodus 33:11. This intimate relationship sustained him through the toughest times. Finally, Moses' story reminds us of the power of obedience and the consequences of disobedience. Moses' obedience led to the liberation of an entire nation, while his moment of disobedience cost him his entrance into the promised land. As we reflect on Moses' life, let's ask ourselves, what is our burning bush moment? What impossible task is God calling us to? And how will we respond? Moses' story isn't just ancient history. It's a timeless tale of faith, courage, and the extraordinary things that can happen when an ordinary person says yes to God. May we, like Moses, have the courage to step out in faith, to lead with compassion, and to walk intimately with God. And who knows? Perhaps thousands of years from now, someone might be telling the amazing story of how you changed the world. After all, the God of Moses is still in the business of doing the impossible through imperfect people who are willing to say, "Here I am, Lord, send me." As we come to the end of Moses' incredible story, I hope you've been inspired by his journey of faith, leadership, and perseverance. But remember, your own spiritual journey is just as important and unique. Speaking of spiritual journeys, have you ever wondered what your dreams might be telling you about your spiritual destiny? The Bible actually has a lot to say about dreams and their spiritual significance. If you're intrigued by this idea, I've got something special for you. Right now, you should see a video popping up on your screen about the 7 dreams that reveal your spiritual destiny according to the Bible. Thank you for joining us today. May you and your family be blessed with peace, wisdom, and grace. Until next time, take care and stay inspired.